boys and girls, welcome to VUX World. We are live, broadcasting from the isolation, inspiration, amplification, ideation, incubation station, live on VUX World, on LinkedIn Live. And thank you, those of you that are joining us. This is the podcast where we find really the world's most elite brains on conversational AI, voice technologies, and we pick their brains about how they do what they do so that you can do what you do better. And I am joined, well, first of all, I'm your host, Kane Sims, and I am joined, as always, by co-host Dustin Coates. Dustin, how do?
It's going well. How about yourself, Kane?
Yes, very good, very good. The sun's shining, a little bit of overexposure over this side, I think. It's sun's shining very, very bright, but it's going very well. Yeah, how's things over there?
Yeah, it's going well. Like over there, it's quite sunny here too. So I had to put up the curtain, but it's going well. It's going to be a good weekend, I think, and this is a good way to start it.
It is. I couldn't think of a better way to start it because, ladies and gentlemen, boys and girls, our guest today is Mr. Bob Moore of IBM. Bob, welcome.
Thank you. Great to be here.
It's a pleasure, absolute pleasure to have you on. I've recently come across a copy of your book, and here is the proof. Conversational UX Design, a practitioner's guide to the natural conversation framework. And it was Micah over from the Netherlands who introduced me to this book at one of the voice lunches a couple of weeks ago. And Carol is joining us, one of the organizers of the voice lunches. So welcome, Carol. Yeah, and I was absolutely, because I've been talking a lot about conversational design patterns. And this book essentially is everything that I almost had very loosely going on in my brain put together by someone who knows a hell of a lot more about it than I do. So thank you for joining us, and we'll get into a bit more detail about all of this stuff and conversation design patterns and how to create natural sounding conversations. But to kick us off, do you want to give us a bit of an overview of yourself, Bob, a little bit about who you are, what you do, and what led you to creating this book?
Sure. So I'm a sociologist by training, my specialty is in an area called conversation analysis. So most of the time I study people in the world speaking in natural settings. I work as a research scientist at IBM Research in Almaden. The Almaden Research Center is in San Jose, California. I've worked for about 20 years in Silicon Valley research labs. I've also worked at Xerox PARC and Yahoo Labs, and spent a little bit of time at a video game startup in between. So most of my career I've spent studying people, conversation in the wild. We call it naturally occurring conversation. And as conversation analysts, we go out into the world with recording devices. First it was tape recorders, then video cameras. And we want to capture naturally occurring conversation, not what happens in a lab or synthetic conversation, naturally occurring human conversation in all kinds of different settings. We bring it back to the lab and we transcribe it in excruciating detail to reveal all the details that we usually overlook. And then from that, identify and abstract the formal patterns of how people talk. So that's what I've done for most of my career. But in about the last 5 years, as conversational agents have kind of had a resurgence, and IBM got into the space, we had a couple of products for creating conversational agents. I sort of put on a new hat, and I learned how to design dialogue and build conversational agents using these systems. And the whole time, I've wanted to do this for the past 20 years. I've wanted to create talking machines using my knowledge of how humans talk, but it's only been possible in about the last 5 years. So I've sort of been learning some of the design, some UX design, some dialogue engineering, and I'm trying to bring the two fields together: conversation analysis and conversational UX design.
Cool. And that's when we spoke briefly before, that was kind of a really good analogy. You mentioned that when web design was first kind of becoming a thing, and actually I think it's even mentioned at the first part of the book, is that when people started designing websites, there were skill sets that they took from other areas like graphic design and applied those principles to website design essentially. I'm wondering whether you might be able to kind of elaborate on that a little bit in terms of how you can see the practice of conversational analysis applying to people who are designing and creating either voice or conversational applications.
Sure. I mean, I think we're at a time right now with voice assistants, chatbots, that is kind of equivalent to the late 90s with the web. At that time, the web was a new thing. The tools for creating web pages were in the hands of the masses, but there wasn't yet a practice for web design. It was a brand new thing. It hadn't, the practice hadn't evolved yet. And so you had, a lot of these. You can remember the old style web pages. I remember creating them myself with like Netscape's editor, right? And they were, there's a lot of sort of amateurish looking websites, but if you look at it today, I mean, there's knowledge of certainly graphic layout. There's not incorporated. There's knowledge of typography, of iconography, of photography, like a lot of other fields from a lot of knowledge from the print industry or industrial design have been borrowed and incorporated into graphical interface design. And now it's a mature thing, and it's established, so you can easily hire a web designer or a mobile designer to design these things. But I think with conversational interfaces, we don't have that yet. We're back where everybody, the tools are in the hands of the masses. We see a lot of different kinds of systems, but they're all kind of different, right? There's not yet a standard that has emerged out of people trying to do this. So that's where I'm trying to kind of jumpstart the process. Is I think we're going to need to design something that works like a conversation, a human conversation. We're going to need some more formal knowledge of how human conversation works. And that's not going to come from the past sources of, industrial design or graphic design. It's going to come from somewhere else. And I think conversation analysis, it emerged out of sociology. I think it's got a critical missing piece that designers are struggling with right now. And that is the structure of dialogue, the structure of human conversation. How do you string the bits of natural language together into recognizable kinds of conversational structures? And I think right now I see a lot of designers struggling with that. They're like, we all know how to do conversation, right? So you should be able to design it, but you sit down to design it and you find it's more complex than you thought. And so I think bringing in some formal knowledge from social science, especially the social sciences that focus on conversation in a concrete way, are needed at this time.
Were you an early proponent of that HTML style design of websites, Dustin? The tables and the hyperlinks and all that lot?
Oh, certainly. I was 12, 13 making websites in front page 98, I believe it was what it was.
Right.
It's quite a lot of fun. What about you, Kane?
Kind of. I actually got involved in the whole kind of web design thing a little bit after that. So I didn't really start designing things like websites and mobile apps till probably, I would say about maybe 8-10 years ago, tops, something like that. At that point, websites were starting to get a little bit better. It was like I've definitely built a lot of HTML kind of tables and all that kind of stuff as a quick way of mocking up stuff. But in terms of actual the practicalities of building stuff, I kind of come into it all a little bit later than that. But I'm definitely a fan of the Wayback Machine, which I use every now and then to go and if you haven't seen the Wayback Machine, it's absolutely fantastic. You can go to it, put in any website, and it'll show you what it was like in like 1996 and stuff, which is it's fantastic.
That's great.
But you mentioned there, Bob, you were saying that what the kind of like social sciences and conversation analysts have is an innate understanding of how dialogue is structured, and that kind of stuff can apply to people who are creating conversations. I'm wondering whether you might be able to elaborate or help us define a little bit what you mean when you say the structure of dialogue.
The structure of dialogue. Well, you need to, the whole challenge with dialogue is to figure out what the agent should say after the user says something, or what the user might say after the agent says something. And there are patterns to how we do this in conversation. Now, I need to give a caveat. You don't have to design your agent like a natural conversation. You can do it however you want. And that's, I think that's, we can create new forms of interaction. We don't need to follow conversation. So I sort of take, my preference or my choice is for a style that does follow conversation, but not human conversation. But so there are mechanics to it. So we build up conversation out of sequences. There are sort of two main sequence types, what we call adjacency pairs. They're paired actions. For example, if one person does an invitation, that makes relevant an acceptance or a rejection in the next turn. Those two turns, the invitation and then the acceptance or the rejection, are a pair that that forms kind of a basis, a part of that conversation, and then it can be expanded out. So you might have a preliminary to the invitation. Are you busy tonight? Right? Are you busy tonight? It's a preliminary to that invitation, and we hear it that way. We don't hear it usually as an innocent inquiry into what you're doing. We hear it as a preliminary to some kind of invitation or request. So that's a way to expand that pair. Or we might say, well, where are you going? We might ask some questions about the invitation before we accept it, and that can expand it. And so, and we also after the end, so that those two turns can be expanded out to form a structure, a recognizable structure. The other main sequence type is a storytelling sequence type. I call it extended telling in the book, but it's storytelling or instruction giving. And it's kind of what I'm doing right now, where I'm giving an extended narrative, and I'm doing it in pieces. And in between, I can see you nodding. You have the opportunity to give do a continuer. In this case, if it's visual, you can just do a nod. If we were just over voice, you might say or yeah, to signal to me to continue. Or you might say, well, you might stop me and say, well, what do you mean by natural conversation? Or you might do what we call a repair. So that's the other kind of sequence type. And those, from those, we build out the whole rest of the conversation. And there's more to it than that. There's a whole set of practices for repairing troubles in hearing and understanding, for getting the other person to repeat all or part of the previous turn if you didn't hear it all, or to get them to repeat all or part, or to paraphrase all or part of the previous turn if you didn't understand some part of it. So there's organization of repair that runs through there. There are practices for opening the conversation with hello, how are you? The first order of business. There's systematic practices for closing the conversation. Often we do what we call a pre-closing, where we say, all right then, or I got to be going. Basically, one party proposes that closing could be done next, but the other party has to ratify it, and they may or may not. They may say, oh, I wanted to bring up this other topic. It gives them the opportunity to bring up another topic. Then they do the pre-closing again. If they both ratify that, then in the next turns you get, okay, goodbye. So there's structure all through that. How we do that, there are predictable patterns, and what conversation analysts do is through our transcripts and our recordings, we capture people doing that. We compare lots of different cases, and from that describe these mechanisms that we as people use to accomplish a conversation.
How much of these structures are cultural, and how much of these are global and innate to all of us?
That's a good question. It appears, and conversation analysis is an international discipline. It's done by people in different cultures and in different languages. I, of course, know pretty much only English conversation analysis. But what we found is that the interaction patterns are pretty universal. And this is something I haven't really talked about yet, but there's a notion of sort of the language and the interaction. And the interaction patterns are kind of more basic, very basic. And the language then is sort of what we layer on top and how we accomplish it. So for example, an offer. There's a lot of ways to offer somebody something, and then they accept it or they decline or they reject, kind of similar to an invitation. I can do that without language at all. I can hand something out toward you, and you can take it or not. I think we learn the interaction patterns before we can speak, and they're very basic. And it appears from the research that most of the interaction patterns themselves are very universal. Now, there are, of course, differences, cultural differences around them, but the basics are pretty much the same. There's sort of lengths of pauses that are considered normal. That varies a bit with culture, but overall, we found that a lot of the basics, like how we negotiate turn taking, a lot of the basic sequence types, things like offers and invitations and requests, are very quite universal. But that's part of the that's part of the research. If you were to find people in speak Italian or Swahili, they do this differently, then that'd be paper. And there are some papers of cultural differences, but they seem to be relatively small. And so what that means is that's good news for designers. That means what we can do is we can reuse the dialogue patterns and translate the language, but keep the same dialogue patterns. And I think that's a critical piece. If we had to reinvent them for every language, then that would be a problem. But we speak across. People learn different languages, and the interaction they have to pretty much take the same form, regardless of which language they're in.
Interesting. And thank you everyone for dropping your comments in the broadcast. And I know I can see a few questions coming through. Do keep the questions coming, and we will get to them either throughout the conversation or towards the back end of the conversation. We will definitely do that. You kind of touched on there, Bob, in a second ago. You were talking about that there are different ways of designing conversations, and the situation that you're kind of proposing isn't the only one, and you're not necessarily proposing that it's the right one. You're just saying that it's the one that you kind of prefer. Some of the other ways of doing it, which you also kind of outline in the book, is the kind of the tree-based design, as well as the kind of the almost like the voice control, like the request response kind of thing, and the other types of doing it. What, in your words or in your mind, is the difference or advantage of, I think you call it natural conversation design rather than anything else? What's the differences and the advantages of using that approach to creating conversations versus using like a tree-based narrative or something like that?
Well, first of all, human conversation is like very versatile, and it's very flexible, and we can use it to adapt to all kinds of differences in knowledge and misunderstandings, different kinds of interactional troubles. And so it's a very flexible machinery. And if we can get a machine that can do that, that'll be very powerful. Let's see. So now I don't think we're there yet. I don't think we're fully there yet. But that's useful. Another thing is that if you want sort of more practical, if you want to use your conversational agent on different channels, on different platforms, that can be an issue, right? So say you've got a sort of standard chatbot, it will give back sometimes paragraphs of text, often will have or give back lists, uses buttons and menus and other kinds of graphical elements. If your client says, "Oh, this is great, that we love this. Now we want to do it over telephone or over a voice-only assistant," now you've got a problem, because that conversation is not going to work. The paragraphs and lists are not going to work over voice, and of course, buttons and menus are not available. So what do? Now you have to redesign. You have to design something else. You have to design a voice first or a voice-only kind of agent. And now you've got two different agents, right? And the way you interact with them is different. The way the user interacts with them is a little different. If you design it from the start more like a natural conversation, then it'll work on any of these platforms, and it'll even work like, especially it'll be most suited for things like a robot interface or an avatar interface, right, where it's with the actual human speaking. But it'll also work, with voice only. It'll work with SMS. It'll work with mobile, desktop, or whatever. And so that's the concept that we have of conversation first. You design it like a conversation and part of that is that the utterances they're shorter than what you get in documents. Documents have pages and paragraphs, right? That's not talk. That's not conversation. If you break it, conversation has shorter bits to enable more back and forth, sort of fast-paced back and forth. And so the content needs to be designed for that. And also you need to be able to accomplish all the actions, introducing a topic, getting details, moving on to the next topic, whatever is going on in your application. You need to be able to do that through all the words. Through only words, if you're doing that through voice only. So you can create it, so there's things like that to make it conversational, to make it more like a human conversation. And then, with our design framework, actually, I'm agnostic as to whether it's going to be eventually on text or on voice. And I tried and do it so that it's on both. And what we do is design it so that it works like a conversation. The conversation part works the same way on any of the channels. And then on the channels that have screen real estate, we can use that to enhance the conversation, but not to change its mechanics. So we have an application with, it has got some cards. It's a travel agent, and it got some cards that have information on destinations or attractions or flights. And so you can click on a card. We've added that, if they click on the card, we tell the conversation, oh, they just clicked on the card for Las Vegas. So we give the context to the conversation system. But the conversation doesn't work in fundamentally a different way. It works the same way, whether it's over voice or text. So I think that's the most immediate benefit, is that I see teams where they built an agent for one channel, and then client wants to go to a completely different channel, and they have to redesign the whole thing from scratch because the interaction doesn't go across.
Mm. And last time we spoke again, you had a very good way of phrasing, and maybe you've kind of touched on it, but you had a very good way of separating out the interaction from the dialogue. I'm wondering whether you might be able to kind of explain a little bit about what you mean when you say interaction.
Sure. So I think you mean interaction, separating the interaction from the language.
Sorry, yeah, that's right.
Yeah. Okay, so that's kind of a high level. I think that I think interaction is the missing piece right now. By that, I mean that we have, I think to build a conversational agent, you need three things. You need language, you need knowledge, and you need interaction. Language, we have pretty mature tools for speech to text, right? Automatic speech recognition, for text to speech, for natural language understanding, for natural language processing, right? We have a lot of tools for that, to recognize language and to produce language. So that I think we're doing very well there. Knowledge-wise, we have a lot of tools and methods for accessing information, for accessing knowledge, for doing reasoning. And your agent needs access to knowledge. Otherwise, it's got nothing to offer, right? If it doesn't have some kind of knowledge about, I don't know, whatever it is, entertainment, medicine, travel, whatever it is, it needs access to some useful knowledge. Otherwise, you're just having a conversation about nothing, which is also kind of fun too. But so it needs knowledge, right? It needs useful knowledge. And then the third thing is it needs to be able to adapt that language and that knowledge to some activity, to some interactional activity. So it might be that it answers users' questions. That's one kind of activity. It might be that it tells stories. Now, you can ask questions and tell stories about the same topic. About, it might be, some latest movie with the characters, right? And you can answer questions about that movie, or you can tell stories about the movie, or you can quiz the user, do a trivia quiz. That's yet a third activity. And so those interactional activities, we need to, the agent needs to be able to adapt to those and to perform those. And I think that's the missing piece. When it comes to that dialogue, we pretty much give designers a blank page and say, you figure it out. You figure out how to design the dialogue such that it does storytelling, or such that it does quizzing, or it does question answering, or complex requests, whatever. That is the least developed leg of the three-legged stool, I think, where we're really relying on designers to figure it out. And that's really the piece that I think conversation analysis can help with. I mean, we need all of it, right? We need the language, knowledge, and the interaction. But I think the interaction right now could benefit from conversation analysis, because that's really what we focus on, is what the interaction patterns, exactly those, how the activities are structured as a back and forth between people.
Interesting. So what are some of how can someone who is creating some kind of, and thanks, by the way, I know there's a few questions here now being posted, and we'll get to those very shortly. how can someone who's creating a conversational agent, how can they recognize whether there is something that might not be quite right? You're talking about the interaction being the missing piece there. How would you approach analyzing a conversation to see whether or not the interaction part is right? How can people identify whether they need to improve that interaction side of what they've done? Does that make sense?
Yeah, I think so. I mean, I think there's we don't have a good tool for this, but I think at this point it's going to be subjective. Well, you're going to inspect it. So I think first of all, if you as the designer observe the interaction, you're going to say, something's not right, because we all know how to do it, right? We all know how to do the interaction. When we play it out, we say, that doesn't feel that doesn't seem quite right. I think you're going to have to use our tacit knowledge of how conversation works. That's the first thing. The second thing is that the users will do the same thing, and they will sort of make noise and say things in response to the agent that point out that it did the wrong thing. And so I think we'll also see evidence in the users' responses that it didn't really that something's wrong. But I don't think we have a tool at this point that we can sort of run through conversation logs, user logs, and automatically identify these problems yet. Although that's a great research project. Does that get at your question?
Yeah. No, I think so. Yeah, I think that's good. So we've got a question here from Amy Stapleton. Shout out to Amy. So she said she's got a longish question. Loves the idea of patterns. My question is, where do you keep and manage, 1, all the logic required to interpret user responses, and 2, all the possible prompts and responses that goes along with the patterns? And maybe I don't know if Dustin wants to weigh in maybe on some of the technical side of things, but Bob, when you're kind of creating these interactions and when you're creating these back and forths, how do you kind of keep on top of the logic that's needed to determine what is said, what the user's saying, and also all of the prompts and responses that you need to serve?
I guess I don't have a fancy answer for that or solution. I mean, while my design framework, which I call natural conversation framework, the design framework itself is agnostic to platform because it's a set of abstract patterns. Although that's the case, when I build systems, I build on IBM's Watson Assistant. I built on Watson Dialogue before that, and usually most of the logic and the responses are contained in the skill file, the JSON file that is the skill file. And the reason I do that, so actually, I think one thing that's kind of important here is that I think a benefit of a lot of these current platforms, whether it's a Watson platform or Amazon or Google or Microsoft, one nice thing is that they tend to have dialogue editors that anyone can use, right? They're simplified graphical programming interfaces. And what that does is it enables non-programmers to build stuff. And then that's why I learned, because I'm not a programmer, but I could pick this up. And so when you are doing one of these projects, there's always a question of where should certain things live? Should they live in the conversation file, dialogue file, or the conversation file, or on the back end or on the front end? And I think those, technically you can put them all kinds of places, but I think where you put them has implications for who controls them. And so I think I tend to put anything that's like the structure of conversation, I keep it in the conversation file so that the conversation designer has control over it. Once you start putting too much of that on the back end, well, now the back end guy or girl, or woman, your back end person is now in control of it. And now designing across that, it becomes more difficult. So I try and make it so that the dialogue contains sort of all the logic and most of the responses. Although if you've got dynamic responses, you need to bring that in from a third-party API or database or something like that. And I try and design it so that the conversation is talking to the backend and asking the backend for very backend kind of things, sort of structured query kind of stuff, kind of thing that backends usually do, like database kind of queries, rather than putting a lot of the conversation logic on the back end. I don't want the back end to have really any conversational logic. I want it to be all in the conversation. Now, depending on your use case, it's going to vary, but I try and, I think the principle is that if you keep it where the conversation designer has control, then they can control the user experience. They can make sure it's consistent, and and they can be responsible for it. So I'm not sure if that exactly answers the question, but
I think it does.
there's a follow-up.
Yeah. I think we've covered this before, Justin, haven't we, in terms of separating the content from the logic?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I mean, yeah. Just because of the tooling, I guess the two kind of tend to go together. But conceptually, there's a difference. Like conceptually, the patterns I have they're written in terms of, not in terms of the content, but in terms of the actions, and so they are separate from the content. And I could imagine, I'd like to build a content editor where a content person could just write utterances and have it automatically inserted into the dialogue. They don't, so that they didn't have to get their hands dirty with that. We don't have that tool yet, but conceptually you could do that, because sometimes, I think the content person may be different from the conversation designer, right? It might be some person who knows health insurance policy, right? They're experts on that. You want them to do some of the utterances, not all of them, but like the utterances about sort of questions and answers, whatever. They probably don't want to get their hands dirty with dialogue, but then, I think you need still a conversation designer who is going to be in charge of the whole thing, be responsible for the flow of the conversation, be responsible for all the conversation management actions like repairs and openings and closings and stuff that, a health policy professional is not going to care or know about.
Mm.
And I think, Bob, what you were mentioning earlier gets a little bit at another question that we have from Richard, maybe a little bit different topic, but he was saying that Dialogflow, Alexa, Watson, what role can these platforms serve to help the industry get better at creating more complex conversations? Is this a role for the platforms?
For the platforms? I mean,
or for the technology in general, perhaps?
Yeah, I mean, I think ultimately it's the role of designers, and I think designers need to learn something new. I think designers need to really be experimenting now and be looking for new sources of inspiration. For example, from social science, and I think it's up to the designers. I think the platforms are fairly powerful, but they give you kind of a blank page. It's a tool, right? They don't create the conversation for you. I think now we really need to see the creativity of designers in using that to push what's possible. And I think we'll see a lot more as possible. I think it's this sort of current generation. I don't know. I think it's fairly simple in terms of the interactional complexity. I think we'll see that get more complex as time goes on. I mean, so for example, what designers could do is they could start from scratch. They could observe how humans talk. You could go to a public place and observe humans talking. You might even record it so that you can get the details and see how they talk, and then model your interaction, your dialogue based on that. And that's sort of the primary way to do it. What I'm suggesting is we have a whole science that has already done that, or has already done a lot of that. Why not take the fruits of that discipline of conversation analysis and try and first start with that and see, can we apply the patterns that conversation analysts have discovered, rather than going out and becoming a conversation analyst. So I think we can jumpstart that by taking advantage of that literature. And there might still be you're interested in a use case where there really is no literature on that, and then go out and observe it. Then I think then we would need the basic science. But where things are already solved, we already know how things are already organized. That's been my project, has been to take that knowledge and make it more accessible to designers. Because if you just kind of go to the conversation analysis literature, it's not written for designers. It's kind of hard. It's not that accessible. So I've been trying to kind of translate it and sort of learn both sides and try to bring the two together. I need to let my dog out. Hold on a second.
Yeah, that's
Go ahead,
right. No
talk.
worries. Yeah, that's cool. That's cool. Yeah, I think it's an interesting because what you're touching on there essentially is that it's almost like what you're describing as conversation analysis in that instance is it's essentially user research, isn't it, in this context?
Yes, absolutely, absolutely. Yes.
And Ahmed Mansi has asked the question that essentially is right up that street, and maybe you've answered it, maybe not, but I'll put it to you anyway. And
Yeah,
if
yeah.
there's anything else that we can dig into, so
Sure.
so Ahmed's saying, how do you listen or observe people's conversations to build a structure or a pattern? Is it something where you would invite them into a lab to do a test-based scenario, or do you go out into the field? And how does that whole process work? If there isn't anything that, so we'll come on to the literature in a minute. Maybe you can tell us a little bit more about where people can go to find this literature, as well as the book. But if there's nothing in the literature, if you need to go out and you need to do this kind of stuff, how do you do it? Do you go out into the field? Do you find people? Do you bring people to the lab? How does it all work?
Yeah, I mean, ideally, you go out into the field. I think, and it's always best to start there, because that's natural, right? That's what people, that's how they do it, right? Is for real. The lab, I think you can use selectively if you have a good idea of its limitations. I think starting in a lab and doing everything in a lab runs the risk that you're producing something that it's not natural, that that doesn't represent what people do when they're out in the real world. So I think lab can be used, but you need to be careful. Ideally, I think you want to capture it the way it happens, and learn from that. I mean, that's conversational analysis is fantastic. I mean, this is I have a career in it because as an undergrad I was exposed to it, and I just thought it was fascinating. It's like, here is a study of what we naturally do and we take for granted, so we don't really notice it. But once you see, a formal description of the mechanisms of conversation, you're like, wow, I'm doing that. I can see myself doing that. I didn't have that kind of clarity about it before, and so I encourage people to do some conversation analysis. In fact, we have in the book, the last chapter is on design thinking for conversational UX, and one of the exercises I recommend is to listen to a tape recording of a natural conversation. And there are places where you can get some that are recorded, or you can record your own, and then analyze a transcript. I mean, this is like introduction to conversation analysis. And analyze a transcript of it to see, what is the animal that we're working with here? What does the animal look like? Because we have to be very clear about that. It's not a book, right? It's not like language in a book. Language in a book has a very different kind of format. If you analyze a human conversation, and like I said, if you have a transcript, it makes it a lot easier because it kind of freezes it, right? It freezes it so that you can see it. People speak sometimes in sentences, but often they speak in phrases or single words, right? So the sentence is not quite the right unit of analysis, right? we call it actually term constructional units, which could be words or phrases or sentences, and we put those together to make utterances. And utterances, they tend to be much shorter than a paragraph in a document. And just getting a feel in a conversation, they tend to be very short. Human conversation is very fast, and in fact, we are good at achieving no gap or overlap between our turns. Now, sometimes minimal gap and minimal overlap is normal, but we're very good at timing them, and that is because as I'm speaking, you are analyzing what I'm saying, and you're projecting where I'm going to end, and then you can come in right at the end of mine with your next relevant utterance. This is something that's actually not possible with a lot of today's agents, except for things like, well, I don't want to get in. I think there's some systems that can do it, but right now, most systems, they don't start analyzing what the user says until the user is done. And in fact, after a short pause after the user is done. So we get these really long pauses today. But I think by analyzing a human conversation, and we time the pauses in our transcripts, you can see, oh, it's very fast. And in fact, 0.5 seconds, that's noticeable. And in fact, anything over a second is fairly long. So if you have you're designing your agent, and you're going to have a place where there's a 30-second silence. That's huge. That's ridiculously huge for a voice conversation. So that kind of thing. I encourage people, especially I encourage designers to do at least to get their feet wet. Is that right? Feet wet with conversation analysis. Learn some of the basics. Do some, but then also take advantage of the studies that have been done, and don't try and reinvent the wheel. Take advantage of what's out there already, and then see if there's something you can use already before you go and try and start from scratch.
In terms of the stuff that has been done already and the studies that do exist, do they detail like here's a conversation design pattern, or here's how a conversation works when it comes to, I don't know, booking a taxi or certain like topic areas, or is it just general observations of other types of conversations? Like if someone's working on a very particular type of use case, is the chances that there's already research being done in that particular area, or is it more general conversation analysis literature that's out there?
Papers in conversation analysis tend to focus on use cases, actually. I mean, we don't call them use cases, but they focus on particular kinds of settings or activities. So it might be doctor-patient interaction, and then usually a paper will be focusing on some part of doctor-patient interaction. For example, giving a diagnosis. So if that's related to your thing, then you'll find a paper that's focused on that. Or I did my dissertation on telephone survey interviews and actually repair within those. Or I've done studies of people ordering documents at a print shop, and so it's focused on that. So you will find, so they are fairly focused, and the good thing about them is that conversation analysis studies, they have a bunch of transcripts in them, examples of transcripts, and we build up an analysis usually from a simple clear case to then more complex cases. But there's transcripts in there, so there's patterns there, so you can see what it looks like, and that's important if you need to build it, right? It's not, we're not going to give you like numbers, pretty much. We're not going to give you, here's a table with causal effects of different kind of statistics. That's not really useful for design. But if you have these patterns of, here, look, this is one way that people did it, here's another way, and here's a third way. Now you see, from looking at those three cases, you can see the pattern. That's going to be more helpful to you when you need to build, potentially those three different pathways, right? It's very empirical. It's very empirical in an observational way, or empirical in a direct way. So I think that's what makes it more useful, because you can see exactly what they're talking about. Now, in terms of finding a study that sort of covers your use case, you may or may not find that. But I think as you start to think about conversation in terms of its form or its structure or its shape, you realize that that different use cases will have the same or very similar shape or interactional forms in them. So whether you're ordering a coffee at Starbucks or you're ordering a document at a print shop, there's going to be a lot of parts of the interaction that are the same. A lot of the interactional forms are going to be the same, although what you're ordering and sort of the domain is going to be kind of different. And so when you look at it that way in terms of form, sometimes you will find a study that's not on the right domain for your use case, but it is the same kind of activity, and you can interactional activity or interactional form, and you can take advantage of that.
On a practical level, if people are just getting started out, they're not super familiar with this, how would they go about finding these studies? I imagine it's not as simple as www.google.com, conversational analysis, doctor patient, or is it that simple?
I think it kind of is that simple. Now, I think that the issue is that conversation analysts don't write for designers. They write for it's fairly academic. So it's kind of hard. I don't think it would be so easy to get into for designers. So that's why I wrote the book. I wrote this book along with my co-author Rafael Arar, who's a designer, to try and bring some of the basics of that literature to designers, to make it more accessible, and not just bring it to them, but I've also built all of these things, right? So I'm learning some design, and I'm trying to bring the two together. So I would start there at least, and from the book, get a basic understanding of conversation analysis, of conversation patterns, interaction mechanics, and then maybe venture into particular studies. I think ultimately, if you want to go deep, on understanding the science, then ultimately, you'll have to go to that literature. But you can pretty much Google it, I guess. Yeah.
Cool.
No, we
go on.
I was just, I think, going to do the same thing. Mention
go
that we
on,
do
yeah.
have a few more user questions. If we miss any of them, sorry. A lot are coming through. Just mention in the comments. And Simon was asking, could TV or movie screenplays be useful?
Yes, I think they have some use. They are, they're kind of idealized, and of course, when we're building a conversational agent, that's also idealized interaction. So I think they have some use. I think the conversation science or the conversation analysis is going to give you a fuller picture of the mechanics. But I think dialogue is somewhat useful. I've used that, experimented with using that before to recognize different kinds of phrases for different kinds of actions. I think you need to use it carefully because it's not, it's somebody's idealized version of reality versus something closer to a reality. Cool. And one thing that's nice about it is we have a lot of movie and TV scripts that are publicly available. So that's a nice data source. And so we've experimented with that a bit.
Yeah, I sometimes recommend for people, and now that you've kind of, so in the past we've done workshops where we've done that. We'll have people play out the conversation. It's staged, obviously, so it's not natural, but you'd have them play out the conversation, and then you would take that as your first pass of your kind of dialogue. But what I've done quite a lot in the past, only because I used to do it myself, I used to read. So on the BBC have got a site called the Writers' Room. And essentially, it's just loads of the old scripts and stuff like that from dramas and comedies and stuff like that. And I used to just read them just to see how, because obviously writing dialogue is different to writing for something to be read. And so I used to read scripts for that purpose, is to see how do you write dialogue. But what you probably don't get from that, given what you've just explained, is you probably don't get the natural cadence or interaction of a conversation. You might get the dialogue right in, but not necessarily the interaction. Is that fair to say?
Yeah, the way I was going to put it is that you don't get as much of the things like repair. So what'd you say? Could you repeat that? The what? If you do get repairs, it tends to be more meaningful. Like somebody is making a statement, they're challenging by saying, what do you mean? Versus just, I don't understand. So the sort of mundane repairs we do, things like sequence closers, like, okay, you get fewer of those. I noticed that people don't do a proper closing on TV shows on the telephone. They usually hang up before they've said goodbye. There's probably dramatic reasons for doing that. It probably seems better on screen than a more natural one. So that's what I'm saying. It's in its idealized version. I don't want to say it's not useful because we're in creating a conversational agent, we're doing the same thing. We're creating an idealized version, but there's going to be things that are missing. It's not the whole. It leaves some of the details, and certainly, one of the challenges. Here's the other challenge. You get a movie script. So one of the things, the applications that you can do with our design framework, and especially, so I've got a template. Basically, it's a skill. It has all these conversation patterns. One thing you can do with it is adapt it for characters, right? Characters from a movie or from TV show. I'm not sure if I should say which one I've done, but one of the issues there is that if so the great thing is that you've got all these movie and TV scripts that you can use for content. I can have my agent say this and that because the character does that. But of course, the character in the script, there's just one path, right? And in a live, with a conversational agent, with a live interaction, you need to build out a lot of paths, right? Alternative paths that character never took. And so, you need to sort of think a little more systematically. And that's where I think the scripts are only going to get you so far. You need to know, okay, yeah, at this point, this character said this, but what are the other things that they might have said? And what are the things that a user might say at that point? I need to build out some of those too. So it doesn't get you all the way, but I think it's useful. And I think it's useful to, I would be more happy if a designer is kind of using dialogue from scripts as a reference than using documents with paragraphs and lists and all the kind of document formatting that I don't know that all the formatting that comes along with documents. I think the dialogue, written dialogue, is closer to the thing that we're trying to emulate.
We've got a question from Micah, and we've got a lot of people still in the show. There's about 25 people tuning in. So if you've hung around this long, then you're obviously well into this stuff. And so I think we can go a bit deeper, which Micah is definitely taking this deeper. So question for Bob: can you expand? Because you were just talking about dialogue and writing and design and stuff like that. So Micah's question is: can you expand on the concept of expandable sequence a little bit more?
Sure. Right. So I mentioned that a little bit before, but so this is sort of let's see. So one of the basic units to conversation is a pair, adjacency pair. It's kind of a tricky term, but it's a pair of actions, right? An invitation and an acceptance. And a lot of times you get just the two turns, right? So one person says, "Hey, you want to go out for a pint?" And the other guy, and you say, "Yeah, sure, Bob, I'd love to go for a pint," right? You get the two turns, and a lot of times you just get those. But the sequence is expandable depending on a variety of things. So I might first check to see if you're available. Oh, are you busy tonight? What are you doing tonight? And if you say, "Oh, I'm recording a podcast," then I'm probably not going to ask you to I won't ask you to go out for a pint, right? I'm screening for the conditions on which my request or my invitation are dependent. So I'm doing that's a kind of preliminary. So now I've expanded those 2 turns into 4 turns, right? Are you busy tonight? No. Oh, would you like to go out for a pint? Sure. Right. So now it's 4 turns. You might get expansions in between the 2 pieces, right? So I might say, you want to go out for a pint? You might say, oh, what time? 7 o'clock. Okay, great. Or you might say, oh yeah, what time? Where you want to go? You might insert some sequences in there, some more pairs in between those 2, and then finally at the end there might be additional expansions there. At the very least, something like, okay, great. Sequence closer. Great. Thanks. You're welcome. And so those 2 pairs, they're what we call the base sequence, but that base can get expanded kind of like an accordion, depending on things like, I'm checking to see if you're available. You're checking to see where we're going or to get more information from me. After any turn, there might be a repair of what did you say? What did you mean? And those repairs then are also expansions. And so you need to have the concept of pairs that are expandable depending on different contingencies that might happen with different users. And that's kind of we don't really have that concept in the tooling. The tooling is just, user says something, agent says something, right? This is a higher level concept of a base pair that can be expanded to pretty, the sort of number of different permutations of expansions is huge. Like, with the ones that I build in possibility, certainly for repairs, multiple repairs after any turn, sometimes with preliminaries, and usually with the post expansions of okay, thanks, stuff like that. So the number of possible combinations you could have is huge in terms of sequences, in terms of, one user doesn't know something, one user can't quite hear because it's too noisy, another one doesn't understand, right? So you get a lot of different possibilities from that, just that pair, that base pair of actions.
Wow. So it's almost like I can visualize it now in terms of how you might get that in your head straight. So you've got essentially the beginning of the conversation and the end of the conversation, which is the sequence, if you like, and then you could jump from there to there, from one to the other, providing the condition is right. But in between that, it's almost like you're describing, gathering, and I think we might have spoke about this briefly last time I met, in the kind of VUX design language. You're almost talking about ways in which you gather the slot values. Is that fair to say? In that, if you want to, if the use case is arrange a pint, and it starts out with, do you want to go for a pint? Then there are certain things that you need to know in order to finish that conversation, having arranged going for a pint. Where we're going to go, when are we going to go, what time we're going to go? Is it just going to be me and you, or are we going to do some other people coming? So certain information that needs to be gathered potentially. So is that kind of the way that you think about it, is to gather the slots, or do you not even think about that and you just design the conversation?
I mean, the thing is, in conversation analysis, we talk about all kinds of slots, more than just the slots that are dialogue designers talk about. Dialogue designers usually talk about, when they say slot, they are usually talking about the agent eliciting additional detail from the user, right? In order to, book a plane ticket, I need to know, the agent will need to know where do you want to go, where are you starting from, what are the 2 dates, right? And we think of those, if the user doesn't give them, then we use slot filling we use slot filling basically to get those 4 details. Conversation analysts think of, there are a lot of other kinds of slots. So for example, the user also, in that same use case, might elicit additional information, right? They might not have questions about, what do you mean by origin? You want to know my origin. What do you mean by origin, right? So there's user slots. And then you can think also of repair as slots, of providing a paraphrases or repeats or examples. So there's so I think it's like that slot concept, but sort of expanded to being different, lots of different kinds of slots that have different functions. And we talk about slots, right? There's a slot in a conversation where this action could be done, but whether this user or this person will do it, we have to wait and see. But we built it so that they can do it if it's needed. So yeah, I think it's kind of like that.
So we've got another question from Rebecca Evanhoe. Welcome, Rebecca. Shout out to Rebecca. Question for the panel. A lot of what makes these conversations feel unnatural is that humans take turns very rapidly, but the tech usually requires the silence detection that slows down turn take. And you kind of touched on that before. But is there work being done to improve those limitations on the tech side? Are you aware?
Yeah, I believe I read a blog post a little while back. Microsoft had something they called duplex, where they claimed that it is analyzing while the user is still speaking instead of waiting till the end. I haven't seen an update on that lately. Of course, Google has something called duplex, and I'm not sure if they're using it. That seems to be a slightly different animal, but I'm not sure if it also has that. The duplex capability in a telephone is that you can hear and talk at the same time, right? It's the channel, open channel. So we need to see more of those solutions so that the system can be analyzing the user's talk as it is unfolding. And that's what I was saying before, is that's how we can get the tight coordination between turns, is that, I'm ready to give my next turn before you've even finished your turn. And I can come in right at the end. We're pretty good at projecting or anticipating where the other person's going to end. Now, sometimes we're wrong because you'll add on another clause or another detail and we're wrong, but we're pretty good at it. But the point is we're analyzing it while it's unfolding. And that's really that's a big technical missing piece right now. I hope we see all the main platforms integrate that soon. But yeah, that's until then, voice interaction with a conversational agent that doesn't have that is kind of weird. It's very slow, and you need to get used to that slow pace. You need to adapt to that, unfortunately.
We touched on this though, Dustin, didn't we? Not in terms of the analysis, but Facebook being able to produce synthetic voices in like 500 milliseconds.
Yeah, certainly. And Rebecca, I believe, also referenced a pretty good book as well called How We Talk. And one of the takeaways that I had from that book was if you ask someone a yes or no question and someone takes a while to respond, the question asker has this feeling that there's some, obviously some hesitation, but it takes the message away from that. You're hesitating because perhaps even if you say yes, you don't want to. I wonder, and Bob, you might know more about this, is whether humans, when speaking with computers, they have those same inclinations, those same assumptions, or if it's completely divorced. If they go, okay, well, it's taking a long time, not because it doesn't want to, so to speak, but I understand it's not it's a computer.
Yeah, no, that's a great point. Conversation analysts call that preference structure. Basically, when for paired actions that have binary responses, so the invitation, right? A greeting, greeting just the second part of the pair is just a greeting. But things like invitations, they have acceptance or rejection, right? They have these sort of binary options, and for those, we systematically do them the two different options differently. And we talk about sort of what we do one as preferred and one as dispreferred, and it's preferred or dispreferred in terms of what the inviter, or what the person who's starting the sequence, what they're aiming for, right? If I get the impression that you're inviting me and you're trying to get me to go out and get the drink, right, then the acceptance is preferred, and a rejection or a declination is dispreferred. And what that means is that we do them differently. And so the preferred actions, you get a sure right away, right, with no usually with no gap, and with just a simple simple acceptance. Yes, sure, I'd love to. The dispreferred actions we do entirely differently, and it's structurally differently. And as you pointed out, usually we get a pause, right? There's a pause. So people from the pause alone can see, oh, this is a dispreferred coming. This is a rejection coming. This is a dispreferred turn design. Also, things we tend to get in that turn design, you may get well, you get a pause and then well. Not always, but you well is another key indicator. You usually get accounts. So instead of a no, well, no, I can't. No, I can't. You usually get an account. Well, I'm recording this podcast tonight, so I can't go. Now, often the actual "so I can't go" or "so no" is usually left unstated. Usually, the account alone, you leave it to the other person to reason that, oh, because they got the podcast, you can't, right? So we do it. So that's how we try to avoid doing it, right? We avoid saying no, I'm not going to go out with you, right? We do all this other stuff, and we do it in a very predictable way. So yes, getting back to the technology. So if you have a technology that does silences wrong, then it does interfere with that. And I think you may get, until you get used to the fact that the silences are longer between a human and a conversational agent. First you might miss, you could potentially misrecognize that as being part of preference structure when really it's not. I mean, I still have this experience with, when you have with news correspondents, and they'll be talking to somebody on the other side of the world, and there's a delay. And I still often hear that delay as a dispreferred turn structure, and it's not, right? And as it goes through, you get used to, oh yeah, they're not about to disagree. They're just, there's that pause with everything. So yeah, it's absolutely relevant. This is one of the reasons that, that getting that pause right, getting it shorter, matters a lot, and it won't feel natural until it's faster. And until we can, like I said, analyze what the user is saying while they're still saying it.
Well, Bob, this has been absolutely fantastic. I can't even explain how much I've learned. I mean, I feel as though I've kind of just digested the book in like the last hour, but I'm still going to read the rest of it anyway. And if other people want to read the rest of it as well and get hold of it, where can they go to get a copy?
You can find it on Amazon, right? That's usually the first place to go. Amazon. Morgan and Claypool, they published, or they do the printing. It's published through the ACM, Association for Computing Machinery, and it's in their digital library, but you don't really want a digital copy. And so Morgan and Claypool are the printer. You can go to Morgan and Claypool website, or I'd start first just at Amazon.
Cool. And any other resources or links or anywhere else that you would point people for either finding out a little bit more about yourself and learning more about yourself, or any other resources on this stuff?
Yeah, I mean, you can look at our research blog. If you just Google Bob Moore, IBM research, or IBM Conversational UX Design, it'll take us to our project blog. There's not, that would be useful, and it has links to the book. There's another book as well that we edited last year. And I mean, like I said, I recommend starting, if you're a designer or developer, starting with our book, Raphael and I, and then hopefully you get interested in conversation analysis, and then maybe branch out a bit into that literature. And I cite a lot of papers in the book, but I wouldn't start. I certainly wouldn't start with some of the more technical papers. It's kind of dense, and it's fascinating stuff, but it's kind of academic.
Well, it looks like, I don't know what you're doing for time, and I don't know what you're doing for time, Dustin, but you've got a bit of an encore People are asking whether there's 3 questions. Oh no, there's three books left. But Mike is asking, over already? Can't we continue? So if you have time for one more, maybe we can pick out one more question. Are we
Sure.
good for one more?
I'm good.
Are you good, Dustin?
Let's go for it. Let's do it.
Let's go for it. Right. Okay. I'll tell you what we'll do. If anyone has another burning question, stick it in the comments quickly. And in the meantime, we'll go for a quick one from Himadri, which is how do you decide the length of a conversation and what factors will it depend on?
The length of a conversation. I usually don't decide the length of the conversation. I think that's kind of open-ended. It's more, what are the possible activities that will happen, that can happen, and then and so then the length is sort of, I think you'll get an average length depending on that, but I don't really, I guess I don't think of it in terms of length. Yeah, I don't know. So
you just do whatever's required to satisfy the use case, essentially.
Yeah. Well, if think about what's the use case, we're going to have the agent needs to be able to recommend destinations and attractions and book a ticket, and that'll be like the core of the application. And then an important thing is to be able to handle like reasonable requests from the user for that use case that you don't support, right? So they might say, well, can you make a reservation for me at this attraction that you just recommended? You need to be able to recognize that request, and then you have to say something like, unfortunately, I can't make reservations at this time. You sort of build those out. You build out the intents for those things that are totally reasonable for the user to assume, and then you'll get a certain length. But I don't really think of it in terms of it's just, I never think of it in terms of length. Like, I don't know how long my conversations are.
Do you tend to have a way of, because one of the things that we often get asked is how do you measure whether something is working, essentially? So if you're creating a conversation, you want everyone to go from here to here. What are some of the ways that you either try and learn whether the conversation is working, or do you take that kind of stuff into account when you're designing? Do you kind of design it with the purpose of getting people through the steps, or do you design it with the purpose of just making it seem and feel like a natural conversation?
Oh no, I definitely try and get them through the steps, right? Whenever I analyze user logs, the main question is, did they accomplish the thing that they were trying to accomplish? If it was to get a destination recommendation or book a flight, did they do it? Did they successfully book the flight, or did they successfully get whatever the application is about? So that's like success in terms of the use case. Could they achieve, so we have one for recommending movies. Did they get, did they find in that one, did they get a list of movies that they then interacted with? So that's definitely part of it. Then the other thing I look at is how much effort did it take them to get there? And so sort of so the first one is sort of in terms of the business, like, if you're a travel booking company and you have this automated agent for booking things, in terms of that business, how successful was it? We see 80% of people successfully book a flight and 20% or whatever. That's one kind of metric. The other kind of metric is how successful was the conversation as a conversation. And there I look at breakdowns and repairs, and how often, basically, for the people who didn't achieve the goal of whatever it was, booking the flight, why not, right? Did they get stuck? And did they get stuck for sort of a policy reason? They're asking things that the company doesn't do, or for understanding reasons that the agent couldn't understand what they were saying. And then, of the people who did succeed, was it smoother? Did they have to do a lot of sort of repairs and restarts and multiple attempts? And that will give me an idea of how well is the conversation, are the conversation mechanics working? As the sort of generic conversation mechanics, how well is that? And in fact, I've got some metrics, some experimental metrics that measure that. They measure of the sequences that were initiated. So things like requests for whatever, how many what percentage were completed, and then a measure of interactional efficiency of the ones that were completed. How efficient were they? Right? So, and this gets back to the expansion concept. If you have the notion of expansion, then you have a hypothetical shortest path, and that is just the two parts of the pair. the request and then the granting of the request, right? That's a theoretical shortest path, and then you can look at the actual path, and you see, oh, they asked for clarification, repeats, different additional information. They did a bunch of expansions. Then you can come up with kind of an efficiency ratio, and so that that's I don't know that. I wouldn't say that the most efficient is always the best. I mean, I think if you have a complex area and you successfully, the agent successfully explains to the user what different things mean and they accomplish the goal, that's good. It doesn't. I don't think the most efficient is always the best thing, but it's a measure that gives you an idea of how much extra work are they doing to get to that to get to that goal, and having to do a lot of expansions, or you're just getting this sort of short two-turn sequences.
Cool. We do, if we can do one final one. I feel a little bit bad because Richard has asked this question twice. I think we might have overlooked it. Really quickly, if we can do a 30-second answer, and then we'll turn it over. Then we'll turn it over to Dustin for his final thoughts. What innovative user research methods do you recommend? Our team has had success with Wizard of Oz testing. It's especially effective early on in the design process. What's worked best for you in terms of your research and testing of these conversations?
I don't have a good answer to that. I'm not a big user researcher. What I do, I guess what I recommend is an alternative or a complementary piece, right? So complementary to whatever user research you're going to do, take advantage of conversation analysis literature or analysis in the book, because that's user research that somebody else has already done, right? It's a different kind of complementary user research. I don't think it's not necessarily enough for your use case, but I think that can nicely complement, because you may sort of narrowly do some research on this use case on this product, but if you look at some of the literature on conversation more generally, it'll give you a broader vision of how conversation works. And I think bringing those two together would be powerful. But yeah, I don't have a lot of advice for sort of more standard user research. But try and complement it with both knowledge from conversation science, and also do some like the exercise I suggested of capturing and analyzing a recording of a naturally occurring talk in that use case, in that scenario. Do some of that and get this feel for what is the flow, what is the pace, what is the sort of length of utterances that are normal for that use case.
Great. Well, Bob, thanks so much for appearing and doing this encore as well. Just one more time, if people want to find you online, where should they look?
Bob Moore, IBM Research.
Cool.
Perfect.
You Google that, yeah, you should be able to get everything you need from there. And conversational UX design is the phrase that I use. I know there's a lot of different ways. There it is. Yeah, it's also in the title of the book, Conversational UX Design. It's kind of the phrase I use for design. So if you Google that, you tend to end up at my page too.
Cool. Well, thank you so much. This has been wicked.
Thank you for inviting me, and thank you for Micah for introducing us.
Yeah, and for Micah for instigating the encore. We've never had an encore before. First, and the barometer of a good conversation is how many people stick around, and more or less everyone. We haven't really lost that many people throughout the whole of the broadcast, and we've been going for nearly an hour and a quarter. So it's testament to how stimulating it was. So thank you so much.
Come back anytime.
Indeed, we will definitely take you up on that offer, I think. Dustin, any final thoughts?
No, I think this has been great. Thanks so much, Bob.
You're welcome.
Cool. And one final thought from me. Next Friday, we're going to be speaking to Hilary and Matthew Black of Ask Mav, which is an SMS platform for creating automated SMS messaging, which is hopefully what we can do now is we can take some of these concepts and some of these principles that Bob shared with us, and we can take it into that conversation to learn how to create automated SMS interactions. So hopefully we'll see you same time next week. Until next time,